Hello, this is the backup video for Monday, October 12th, 2020 for European history. Okay. Before we see more film clips from The Agony and the Ecstasy, which is my plan, there are a few notes that I want to go over with you beforehand. So, where we are is the very first page of notes that has pictures on it. And we're going to start with condottieri. Condottieri are oh wow, nope, I have my paperclip in front of the first note. The House of Borgia. The Borgias included a couple of popes. Were famous for their willingness to poison people who got in their way. So imagine a family of Italian aristocrats who will assassinate their way to the top, achieving papal status. It happened. And even in the Vatican, the Borgias behaved famously in a brutal and poisoning fashion. Condottieri. Condottieri are Italian mercenaries. They very famously have sort of a rounded helmet, a bit like a modern helmet. Condottieri, Italian mercenaries during the Renaissance. The House of Medici, de Medici. Lorenzo il Magnifico came from a family that started out as doctors because their name means doctor, of the medics, de Medici. But the Medici house also gained status and power because they became they became actually the premier banking house in Southern Europe. In Northern Europe, it was the Fuggers. In Southern Europe, it was the Medicis, especially in Italy, that could loan money and finance things. The House of Habsburg is going to be an important aristocratic family from the late Middle Ages through the end of World War I. It still exists, but it doesn't rule anything anymore. The Habsburgs famously are the monarchs of Austria, which is from the German word Osterreich, which means Eastern Empire. The Habsburgs are, into modern times, perennially the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is not tightly connected. It is not tightly built. In other words, the Holy Roman Emperor has very limited powers. There are a few reasons for this. First reason is that the emperors are elected. What that means is that every time the old emperor dies, the electors, which include bishops of certain regions, include barons or counts and dukes of certain regions, all come together and vote, or they vote separately, and their votes determine who will be the next emperor. You would think that this is a good system, a reasonable system, a system that will produce an emperor that is appealing. But the emperor's electors are limited to a group of aristocrats who all have their own interests. And these interests compile generation upon generation. And they're different from the interests of the whole empire. Can you shut that fan, please? Thank you. Because of this, every time an emperor dies, anyone who wants to be the new emperor gets to offer things. You know, a criminal court might call them bribes, but really what it is the normal way of doing business to the various electors. Now, these bribes, these favors, could include a promise not to raise taxes on you, maybe everyone else, but not you. Or it could include a promise to allow your region more autonomy. Or it could include any number of things. Because of this, in order to become emperor, the House of Habsburg, again and again, every time an emperor dies, has to give away some power in order to acquire the imperium. The empire is also not designed to be a centrally governed state. It is a loose confederation of German and Italian states, all affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church and all under the emperor, who is sort of a successor to Charlemagne. So the House of Habsburg plays this game more and better than anyone else, and they become the traditional rulers of the Holy Roman Empire. And after Napoleon gets rid of the Holy Roman Empire, they become the traditional rulers of Austria. The Holy Inquisition is established in Rome after the Albigensian Crusade, and it is staffed typically by Dominicans. Dominicans, remember, are the order of preachers. They are the ones that took from the Albigensian Crusade the notion that it was poor religious education that brought about the heresy that led to the crusade, that led to the bloody war. And that can be prevented by good religious education. So one of the things that the order of preachers, or the Dominican order, does is it focuses on teaching theology and teaching true church doctrine, authentic or orthodox church doctrine. But you need a stick as well as a carrot. So the Holy Inquisition is set up in order to make sure that everyone knows that heresy is a crime, and that if you're accused of it, you can recant. Recanting means that you say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Don't listen to what I said. I'm sorry, I was wrong. Don't listen to what I said. Recanting means, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Don't listen to what I said. I'm sorry, I was wrong. Don't listen to what I said. And if you recant with sufficient authenticity and fervor and shame and apologeticness, your punishment may not be levied at all, or it may be limited, but you're going to have to never again teach those false doctrines that you heretofore had believed in with all your heart. So you do have to give that up. In fact, you have to advertise to everyone how wrong you were so that the church's teachings are reinforced. The alternative to this is to be tortured until you recant, or to be executed as a heretic. And the crime for that is very similar to the crime for witchcraft, which is to be burned at the stake, alive. So the Inquisition starts out as a teaching institution designed to correct people, but very quickly, because of all the power, it is corrupted, and it becomes synonymous with cruelty. After the unification of Spain, Queen Isabella kicks out all the Jews. But those Jews that refuse to leave have to convert to Catholicism, to Roman Catholic Christianity. The Inquisition is set up in Spain to watch this formerly Jewish community for false conversions and for backsliding. So if the Inquisition discovers that you, as a former Jew, are still having meetings of the rabbinical type, if you are still teaching the Torah and the Talmud and not the Bible, if you are still engaged in private Jewish worship, they will find you, they will get all the information they can out of you through torture, and they will punish you. The Inquisition does not have authority over Jews that refuse to become Christians, nor does it have authority over Muslims or anyone else. It is a court for believers only. But if you are a Christian, a professing Christian, which almost every European was at that time, uh, it has authority over you. So, scary stuff. The Hussites. Who might they be involved with? The Hussites. Remember Jan Hus, the disciple of John Wycliffe, who was himself burned at the stake? Jan Hus, who's also punished and executed as a heretic. The Hussites are the people who rise up in Bohemia and Moravia, in other words, in Czechia, the Czech Republic, and try to displace the church and the feudal order with something different. And it is the most successful peasant uprising of the Middle Ages or early modern times. It's bigger than the Albigensian Crusade, and it is bloodier than the Albigensian Crusade over a long period of time. The Albigensians are more intense, though, and that fight against them more intense. So the Hussites are the rebels in the Hussite Wars. Linear perspective, we've talked about. It is orienting your drawings or your paintings towards a focal point or a couple of focal points to help the illusion of three-dimensionality. The Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges. It is a French conciliar decree that says that the church should have a council that meets every decade, every 10 years, and that this church council should have authority over the popes. That this church council should have authority over the popes. That's an amazing thing to ask for of a medieval Catholic church or an early modern Catholic church whose definition is about papal power. So, what it really is, can you guess? It's an attempt by the French monarchy to limit the power of the popes. Their attempt to turn the Pope into a French puppet fails. The Avignon papacy is ended, but the French have not given up on trying to turn the Roman Catholic Church into something that is much more friendly with French royal interests. And as such, they attempt the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges. The sack of Rome in 1527 is something that I will play a song for you after I'm done with the video. For those of you at home, I recommend that you look up Sabaton, The Last Stand, the song, because it deals with the sack of Rome. The Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, who has to deal with Martin Luther, among other things, and Suleiman the Magnificent from the Ottoman Empire, and who's also ruler of Spain, the Emperor Charles V, who has rebels in the Netherlands, also decides to bring the Pope to heel. This is after Julius II's time. So he marches into Rome in the late 1520s, and on his way to Rome, he is brutal, and he sacks Rome. Sacking Rome ends the Renaissance. It is considered by many to be the end of the Italian Renaissance, because sacking involves raping and stealing and burning and murdering, and he does this to terrorize Rome and to terrorize the Pope and to terrorize the Curia, which is the papal government, the papal royal court, and it's pretty scary. So the sack of Rome, 1527, and the Song of the Swiss Guards is what I'll be playing for you when we're done. Suleiman the Magnificent famously is pictured with this giant onion-shaped turban on his head because he's the emperor. It's not about being pragmatic or practical. That is a piece of headgear that only an emperor would wear because you can't get anything done while wearing something like that. You try going around with a giant onion turban on your head and see how much work you can get done. You won't even get into a door. This door would not fit you. You'd have to take the hat off and scrooch it through the door because the hat wouldn't fit. Now that's a hat. Suleiman the Magnificent is the greatest of the Ottoman Turks, the greatest of the Ottoman emperors. And Suleiman, in 1529, drives through Hungary, conquers it, at the Battle of Mohawks, where 10,000 blackbirds for all of the dead, and drives to Vienna. Now, Vienna is the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. It's also geographically at the heart of Europe. If the Ottoman Turks seized Vienna, it would mean that Europe was on the way to becoming another Islamic conquest. And the Ottomans could have absorbed not only the Balkans, but they would have been in Hungary long enough to absorb it, and the Eastern German lands and the Czech lands long enough to absorb it, and they probably would have used it as a launching point to attack the rest of Germany, Poland, and Italy, and even towards France. The weird thing is that King Francis of France is an ally of Suleiman. He's a Christian king, a Catholic king, very involved in church politics. But national politics say that France's enemies that Germany's enemies are France's friends, and the Holy Roman Emperor rules Germany, and the Holy Roman Emperor is in a life and death struggle with Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire. So France makes an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, even though they're making an alliance against other Christians. Follow? It's a little confusing. In 1492, as a way of celebrating the conquest of Granada and the driving out of the Muslims from Spain, Queen Isabella celebrates by sending Columbus on his way, but also by expelling all of the Jews. Every Spanish Jew and their family are given these choices. You can leave with a limited amount of portable property, very limited. Most Jewish families would give up most of their wealth and property to the king and queen of Spain in order for the privilege of emigrating. But they'd be gone. Or they can stay and become Catholic. And this is why the Inquisition is set up to keep an eye on them. Or they can stay and become Catholic. So what it does is it faces Jews with a serious problem. It also leads to modern European Jewish history. Because from Spain, most Jews end up going eastward to Poland, Lithuania, and White Russia, what's known as Belarus, and the Ukraine. This area of Eastern Europe becomes the Jewish Pale of Settlement under the Russian Empire in the 18 and early 1900s. It is where most of the world's Jews collect in shtetls like in Tevia's shtetl in The Fiddler on the Roof, or in Jewish ghettos in the cities and towns. They live apart, but they live densely in the Pale. This is where the pogroms happen, where the Cossacks are let loose. And this is where Hitler is going to apply his final solution in the 1940s, which will kill over half of the Jews of Europe. So that comes from the expulsion of Spain's Jews. Some of Spain's Jews go back to the Middle East, and they become Jews under Islamic rule. Which, in some ways, because there aren't as many pogroms on a large scale, might be better for the Jews, but it's still not very comfortable. Okay. The doctrines of Sacrosancto and Acerabilis. Sacrosancto is a doctrine that is pro-church councils. Remember, church councils, like the Council of Constance, ended the Great Schism. And for anyone who has a problem with the popes, conciliarism, which is the belief that church councils should be superior to the pope, seems to be a good answer. This is why the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges advocates for a church council every 10 years to basically second-guess the pope and ultimately dominate the popes. Sacrosancta is an idea that is promulgated that is in favor of conciliarism, the idea that the church council supersedes the pope. But Pope Pius II puts out a papal bull called Acerabilis. And Acerabilis basically puts paid to the idea of conciliarism, saying that the Pope is supreme, the Pope is the heir of St. Peter, not some church council, and as such, he is the rock upon which the church rests, and he is therefore God's vicar on earth and God's chief Christian. The last thing I'll talk about today is pre-modern slavery. A lot of people who take just American history assume that slavery is a phenomenon that affects primarily West Africans when they are brought over in the triangle trade. Well, that is a big part of slavery, but that's certainly not the only part. Wrap your brain around this. Everyone had slaves. In every society on earth before the Industrial Revolution, everyone had slaves. Now, sometimes the slaves were fully slaves. That means human property, human tools, tools in human form with no more legal or moral existence than a rake would, or a hammer would have. Sometimes they're called peasants. Peasants are slaves to the land. Their job is to grow food for their betters. They're not allowed to leave the land. They have limited rights. They're half free, half slave. Serfs are between peasants and slaves. They're treated like slaves. They're treated much worse than peasants. But serfs can never be sold away from the land or their families. Peasants, neither. But slaves can be sold or bought as individuals. So you could have a mother sold away from her children, or children sold away from their mother. Traditionally in Europe, before modern times, slaves were from the Slavic race, the slave race of Europe. The Slavs include the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Serbs, the Ukrainians, the Romanians, the Russians, the Russians themselves, and other Eastern European types. They end up serving as slaves in German households and even in French households in farther west. They are not cotton field slaves. It's not like American plantations. It is a different form of slavery. Many of them are house slaves. Some of them work in the fields. But primarily the fields are worked by European peasants at this time. Another form of slavery is tried in the Americas, and this is going to lead to the triangle trade. When We'll talk more about that later. I'll just give you a hint now. When the Spaniards come, they establish the typical racial mix of every American country from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego. Every single American country from time of Columbian contact has a mixture of Indians, blacks, and Europeans. The natives, the Indians, are conquered by the Spanish, and the Spanish try to put them to work on plantations, making them into basically serfs. They also convert them as much as possible to Roman Catholic Christianity. But these serfs don't work well. You take somebody who is from a Neolithic or a Paleolithic society, particularly Paleolithic, and a lot of the natives were Paleolithic, a lot of the Indians were Paleolithic. They were hunter-gatherers. And you suddenly try locking them onto a single piece of land, chaining them to a single job. A lot of Indians began to just die. They couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle the bondage. They couldn't handle the slavery. I don't know why. It was just they died in captivity. It's like pandas have difficulty breeding in captivity. So the Spaniards and Portuguese decided to take something from the Islamic playbook. They knew that Arabs had kept slaves from Africa. So they began to bring slaves from the Guinea coast of West Africa in particular to the Americans, to the colonies, to function as slave labor. And of course, the rulers of the Spanish and Portuguese territories were Europeans because they were Spanish and Portuguese territories. Every nation in North and South America, including the islands, has a proportion of natives, a proportion of Africans, a proportion of Europeans, and mixed bloods between all of them. The question is, what's the proportion? In the United States and Canada, the proportion of natives is very, very small. The proportion of Africans is a little larger. The proportion of Europeans, very large. The same proportions exist in Chile and Argentina, in the very southern regions of South America. There are more Indians in Chile and Argentina than are in Canada or the United States as a proportion of the population, but not much more. Also, fairly few blacks, fairly large number of Europeans, and mixed. But in the areas between the very northern and very southern tips of the Americas, you have much larger proportions of Indians, much larger proportions of blacks, and much smaller proportions of Europeans. Since the 1820s, Mexicans have defined themselves as being mixed bloods, mestizo and mulatto primarily, but basically mostly mestizo, mostly Indian blood with a little bit of European blood in there. And some places have very large Indian populations. Southern Mexico, for example, Guatemala, Honduras, very large native groups. So there's some distinction between pre-modern European slavery and modern European slavery. Any questions on any of this? Okay. Then what we'll do is we'll be shutting off the video. We'll be going into a couple of music videos, and then, or a music video, and then we will show some more scenes from the Agony and the Ecstasy. You at home, get some work done. Assuming that this mask gets on my face.